On the morning of the 12th of November, 2025, inside the African Union Assembly Hall, an event unlike anything before it unfolded, the entire chamber came to a halt, and every delegate in Addis Ababa understood that a new precedent was about to be set. Ibrahim Traoré, carrying a folder of documents, rose to speak. He was not representing only Burkina Faso, but raising an issue at a regional level. He accused the president of Tanzania, Samia Suluhu Hassan, of violating fundamental rights the African Union is responsible for upholding. This moment raised a question: what happens when one African leader publicly challenges another right inside the African Union? Could this be the beginning of a new chapter in Africa's pursuit of justice? If you care about Africa's independent voice, please subscribe and follow the next developments. When the African Union Assembly Hall fell into complete silence, Ibrahim Traoré stepped up to the podium. The 12th of November, 2025 instantly became an unprecedented milestone in the history of AU summits. Before heads of state, commissioners, and delegates from 45 member countries, Traoré announced that he had officially submitted a complaint to the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, accusing Tanzanian President Samia Suluhu Hassan of severe and systemic human rights violations. In his presentation, he listed a series of actions he described as forming a large-scale pattern of human rights abuses following the October election in Tanzania. According to international observers, Traoré's speech immediately changed the tone of the session, shifting it from routine diplomatic exchanges to a sharply heightened level of tension. It was one of the rare occasions in which a head of state directly accused another sitting president before the entire African Union. In closing, Traoré emphasized that Africa cannot avoid internal issues related to human rights, and that the AU has a responsibility to examine the matter transparently. This event is considered only the beginning of a larger chain reaction, with upcoming steps including investigations, debates, and responses from Tanzania expected to unfold in the following sessions. The African Union Hall fell into absolute silence as Ibrahim Traoré continued his presentation. But this time, he stressed from the outset, these accusations were not directed at Tanzania or the people of Tanzania. They were directed squarely at the decisions of President Samia Suluhu Hassan and her administration. He began with the most serious allegation. After the 29th of October election, at least 37 people were killed, more than 140 went missing, and 95 were severely injured. All were recorded in reports from Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and major hospitals in Dar es Salaam. 12 journalists were prevented from reporting. Traoré called this a direct consequence of high-level orders. End their sight. Next, he referred to the 36-hour internet shutdown, occurring precisely during the vote counting period. Traffic dropped by 97%, making election monitoring nearly impossible. According to Traoré, this was a decision targeting transparency, issued from leadership rather than caused by technical failure. The third accusation concerned arbitrary arrests. At least 22 opposition leaders were detained without warrants. 75 activists were charged with treason. 13 media outlets were suspended within a single month. Article 19 recorded threats against 24 journalists. Traoré stressed, this cannot be called an individual mistake. This is a system. He also presented data on the displacement of more than 36,000 Maasai people from the Ngorongoro region. According to him, the process lacked consultation, lacked adequate compensation, and violated international norms on the protection of indigenous communities. By the 10th accusation, the atmosphere in the hall had completely shifted. Tanzania, under President Hassan's leadership, failed to implement 36 human rights recommendations issued by the United Nations under the Universal Periodic Review. This issue, he said, relates directly to leadership responsibility. And finally, the 11th accusation, the Hassan administration had worsened disparities between Zanzibar and Tanganyika. Spending for Zanzibar decreased by 28%, while Tanganyika received a corresponding budget increase. Civil society organizations recorded a four-fold rise in public dissatisfaction in Zanzibar over 3 years. When Traoré finished, the entire hall felt compressed. Reporters left their seats. Delegations spoke in haste. The Tanzanian delegation remained completely silent. The African Union fully understood the gravity of the moment. This was not a dispute between two nations, it was a direct accusation of large-scale human rights violations, from one head of state aimed at another head of state. When the session finally paused for procedural consultations, the effect of Traoré's accusations began unfolding far beyond the walls of the African Union. In Tanzania, the reaction was immediate and deeply divided. Within hours, citizens in Dar es Salaam, Arusha, and Mwanza gathered around radios and small television sets to hear how their government would respond. Social media, no longer restricted as it had been during the election shutdown, exploded with debate. Some Tanzanians defended their president, insisting the accusations were exaggerated or politically motivated. Others, however, saw Traoré's intervention as a rare moment of continental courage, a chance for their long-suppressed concerns to be acknowledged on the global stage. Families of missing activists began sharing names again. Community leaders who had stayed silent for months cautiously stepped forward. Human rights organizations operating inside the country reported an unusual spike in requests for legal assistance. The accusations had unlocked something, a willingness to speak, even if just for a moment, before the political winds shifted again. Inside Tanzania's parliament, the ruling party scrambled to craft an official response. Opposition members, many already under pressure or house arrest, called for an emergency debate. But government allies refused, labeling the allegations foreign interference. The tension inside Tanzania's domestic politics threatened to spill into the streets, and security forces were placed on standby. Meanwhile, within the African Union itself, the ripple effect grew sharper. Delegates privately expressed concern that Traoré's move could ignite a trend, nations publicly calling each other out in a forum built on unity. Some saw that as dangerous, others saw it as overdue. South Africa's representatives urged caution, emphasizing the importance of due process. Ethiopia, hosting the summit, attempted to remain neutral, but acknowledged the seriousness of the claims. Smaller nations Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Cabo Verde leaned towards supporting some form of inquiry, viewing this as an opportunity for the AU to restore credibility after years of being accused of passivity. African news commentators began asking a question that resonated across the continent. If the African Union cannot investigate its own members, then who will? And yet, beneath the diplomatic phrasing and cautious statements, an undeniable truth emerged. Traoré had forced the entire political architecture of East Africa to confront itself. And the storm he started was far from over. Beyond Tanzania's borders, the political shockwaves spread rapidly across the continent. In Nairobi, Kenyan analysts warned that the accusations could disrupt East African economic corridors, especially if tensions escalated between Tanzania and its neighbors. Uganda's leadership issued a cautious statement urging regional stability, a diplomatic phrase often used when a government prefers not to take sides. In Rwanda, where internal security is treated with exceptional seriousness, the allegations reignited conversations about regional security cooperation and the political fragility of East Africa's electoral processes. Within diplomatic circles, a quiet but unmistakable conversation began. If Tanzania, a nation often viewed as relatively stable, could face such allegations, what did that mean for countries with weaker institutions? This question unsettled many leaders, and it brought an unexpected pressure on the African Union to prove that its human rights mechanisms were not merely symbolic. Inside the AU headquarters, committees worked late into the night. Legal advisors debated whether Traoré's accusations met the threshold for an emergency session of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. Even senior commissioners, long accustomed to the slow pace of African diplomacy, acknowledged privately that the Union was entering unfamiliar territory. Meanwhile, continental civil society organizations sensed an opening. Human rights groups published letters demanding an impartial inquiry. Pan-African youth movements, often divided by language and region, found unusual unity in calling for transparency. In Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré's name began circulating across Africa news talk shows as a symbol of moral fearlessness, even though he was not acting on behalf of his nation that day. To many viewers across the continent, he embodied something rare, a leader willing to confront a sitting president in a forum designed to protect powerful figures. Yet with every rising demand for accountability came an equal and opposite resistance. Some governments feared that supporting an investigation could expose their own domestic vulnerabilities. Others worried that public accusations could fracture the delicate political alliances needed for continental projects, from infrastructure development to collective security pacts. Even so, it became clear that Africa could no longer pretend nothing had happened. The silence of inaction was no longer sustainable, not when the allegations involved lives lost, communities displaced, and democratic processes threatened. Africa stood at a crossroads. Tanzania's response would shape one path, the African Union's response would shape the other. And the world was watching to see which direction the continent would choose. As the political tide surged across Africa, the international response, particularly from the United States, began to take shape. In Washington, analysts at the State Department monitored the developments with growing concern. Tanzania had long been viewed as a relatively steady partner in East Africa. Any instability there would have implications for regional counterterrorism operations, maritime security in the Indian Ocean, and the broader political balance of the East African community. Within hours of Traoré's accusations, American think tanks like the Council on Foreign Relations and the Wilson Center issued preliminary assessments. They noted that the severity of the allegations could not be dismissed as routine political friction. The shutting down of the internet, the mass arrests, the forced displacement of indigenous communities, each of these issues had appeared in U.S. human rights reports before. But never had they been compiled, articulated, and presented so forcefully on a continental stage. Some American commentators went further, calling Traoré's speech a potential watershed moment for Africa's governance landscape. On evening broadcasts, foreign policy analysts explained that when a leader publicly confronts another inside the African Union without hesitation and backed by documented reports, it challenges not only Tanzania but the credibility of the AU as an institution. Meanwhile, European voices began weighing in. The European Union released a cautious statement urging Tanzania to address concerns with transparency and cooperation. France, with historical ties across the region, warned that prolonged tension could destabilize regional trade and humanitarian corridors. The United Kingdom echoed calls for a fact-finding mission. Multilateral organizations also took notice. Officials at the United Nations Human Rights Council requested updated dossiers from regional monitors, while the African diaspora in the United States, Canada, and Western Europe amplified Africa News's coverage across their networks. Online discussions drew parallels between this moment and past turning points in African political reform. What caught the attention of many American viewers was not simply the content of the accusations, but the source. Ibrahim Traoré, already a familiar name to Africa-focused analysts, was suddenly being discussed again in Washington circles. Commentators emphasized that although he was not speaking on behalf of Burkina Faso that day, his posture embodied a rising generation of African leaders unwilling to accept the old culture of silence. For the United States, the question was clear. Would Africa seize this moment to strengthen its institutions or retreat behind diplomatic caution once again? And the answer would depend largely on what happened next inside the African Union. Beyond Washington and European capitals, the rest of the world began forming its own interpretations of Traoré's bold intervention. In Asia, policy institutes in India and China monitored the unfolding crisis closely. Tanzania occupies a strategic position along the Indian Ocean, and any political instability there could affect maritime routes, infrastructure projects, and regional economic partnerships. Analysts in New Delhi noted that the allegations, if substantiated, could reshape East Africa's political terrain for years. Beijing, always measured in its public messaging, simply called for dialogue and mutual respect. But the subtext was clear. China preferred a stable Tanzania, regardless of who led it. In the Middle East, Gulf nations with investments in East African ports watched developments with caution. A shifting political climate in Tanzania could influence long-term trade and energy routes. Meanwhile, African diaspora communities in the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands amplified the story through community forums, live-stream discussions, and commentary channels. Many saw Traoré's courage as symbolic of a new African assertiveness, one that refused to be muted by tradition or hierarchy. Inside Africa, however, the reactions were the most nuanced. Countries with fragile political balances feared the precedent that Traoré's speech could set. If one leader publicly confronted another at the African Union, would their own domestic issues someday be exposed in the same dramatic manner? Yet others, especially nations with rising reform movements, privately applauded the moment. They viewed the confrontation not as chaos, but as clarity, a long overdue demand for accountability. Africa News continued to drive the narrative, publishing analyses, questioning whether this confrontation might mark the beginning of a new political era. Their editors framed the moment as part of a broader continental awakening, a shift away from silence and toward transparency. For older American viewers accustomed to decades of Cold War diplomacy, the story carried echoes of pivotal global turning points, moments when individuals stood up, spoke plainly, and refused to accept political complacency. Amid all this, one truth became increasingly hard to ignore. Ibrahim Traoré's voice had reached far beyond the African Union Hall. It had entered the global arena. He had become, even unintentionally, a symbol of the conviction that Africa must confront its own contradictions to build a stronger future. And now, with the world watching, the stakes for Tanzania and for the entire African Union had never been higher. Just when diplomats expected the African Union to retreat into familiar caution, something unexpected happened, something that neither Tanzania nor the world anticipated. Within 24 hours of Traoré's speech, a coalition of smaller African nations quietly began coordinating behind the scenes. These were countries often overshadowed in continental politics, states with limited geopolitical weight, but with leaders who had grown increasingly frustrated by years of unaddressed human rights concerns. Led by Sierra Leone, Cabo Verde, and the Gambia, the group reached out to 4 others: Benin, Rwanda, Lesotho, and São Tomé and Príncipe. By the next morning, the 7 nations jointly submitted a formal request to the African Union Secretariat, an independent investigative mission into the allegations presented by Ibrahim Traoré. The request stunned the chairperson's office. Historically, such bold initiatives came only from regional heavyweights: South Africa, Nigeria, Ethiopia. But this time, it was the smaller states, the ones with nothing to gain and everything to lose, who stepped forward. And their message was unmistakable. If Africa was serious about justice, size could no longer determine moral authority. Africa News reported the development as a continental realignment. Commentators remarked that Traoré's voice, steady, unshaken, uncompromising, had resonated especially with nations seeking a more accountable African governance structure. For many of these countries, supporting an investigation was not about Tanzania alone. It was about redefining what leadership should look like in a modern Africa. Suddenly, the balance of power shifted. Tanzania realized it was no longer facing a lone accuser, it was facing a coalition. And that coalition had been inspired, directly or indirectly, by the clarity and fearlessness of Ibrahim Traoré. A confrontation that had begun with one voice was rapidly turning into a continental movement. While the unexpected coalition of 7 states pushed the African Union into uncharted territory, an even more startling revelation emerged, one that fundamentally changed how the entire continent viewed Traoré's accusations. Late in the evening, Africa News published an exclusive report citing anonymous officials inside the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. According to the leak, several items in Traoré's 11-point dossier matched findings from a classified ACHPR pre-investigation file, a file that had not yet been released to any member state, including Tanzania. The leaked notes suggested that concerns over electoral interference, forced displacement of indigenous communities, and the misuse of security forces had already been flagged internally months before the AU summit. The report spread like wildfire. Suddenly, Traoré was no longer seen as a lone voice calling out injustice. He was seen as the leader who dared to speak aloud what many inside ACHPR had been too cautious to reveal. Diplomats across the continent began to reassess the risks of aligning with him. What if Traoré had spoken the truth before anyone else dared to? What if his decision to stand up in Addis Ababa had been the push the African Union needed to confront its own silence? Commentators across Africa News, BBC Africa, and Al Jazeera pointed out the significance. This isn't just a political confrontation, it is the moment the African Union is forced to decide whether it serves governments or citizens. In Burkina Faso, Traoré's homeland, his name surged across online discussions even though he had acted in a personal, not national, capacity. Many citizens felt pride, seeing him as the embodiment of a new African resolve. The power dynamic had changed. Tanzania was on the defensive. ACHPR was under pressure. And Ibrahim Traoré had unwittingly become the symbol of a continental awakening. The question now was simple and monumental. Would Africa follow his lead? When the echoes of that historic session finally began to fade, the African Union found itself standing at a crossroads unlike any it had faced before. For decades, the continent had struggled with the tension between sovereignty and accountability, between protecting leadership and protecting the people those leaders were meant to serve. But on November 12th, 2025, something shifted. A line was drawn, not by force, not by foreign intervention, but by the courage of one man willing to speak when silence had become the norm. The consequences of Ibrahim Traoré's actions stretched far beyond Tanzania. They reached into the hearts of ordinary citizens who had long felt unseen. They sparked conversations in parliaments, on radio waves, and in community gatherings. They pushed the African Union to confront questions it had avoided for years. What does justice look like in a new Africa? Who does the Union truly serve? And is the promise of human dignity still strong enough to unite a continent? For many watching from afar, including millions of Americans who have followed Africa's political evolution through African news, this moment felt different. It carried the resonance of history, the weight of moral courage, and the unmistakable hope that nations can rise above old patterns when guided by leaders who refuse to bend. And though Traoré was not speaking for Burkina Faso on that day, the spirit he embodied, the spirit of responsibility, clarity, and fearless truth-telling, became a beacon for a continent seeking renewal. His stance reminded the world that Africa's future will not be shaped by those who hide behind power, but by those who confront it with conviction. In his final words at the summit, Traoré offered a reminder that echoed far beyond Addis Ababa. We did not ask for permission to be free. We stood up and claimed it. If the spirit of Ibrahim Traoré resonates with you, if you believe Africa deserves a future built on courage, justice, and human dignity, then share this story. And subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines. May courage guide Africa's leaders. May accountability strengthen its institutions. And may every voice, from Burkina Faso to the farthest corners of the continent, rise without fear.